Hey woodworkers. Okay, so I have my brick lay all lined up and nice and smooth and squared up, and I'm good. I'm ready to now start cutting out curves. Question is going to be, how am I going to transfer my full-size drawing curve for my design onto this piece? I cover this thing up, then all my lines go away. I have no reference. It just doesn't work. So there's a couple ways that I can do this. I can carve out, or just take this to the bandsaw and go directly into my full-size drawing. That is a perfect match. But then this full-size drawing is ruined, and I'm going to need this for other information like legs and joinery and everything else. So I don't want to touch this. But in thinking along those terms, I could use a rigid piece of material. So I have a piece of masonite here, and I've been able to follow the curvature of my design onto this piece, and this thing works. Now, the question is, how did I get this curve from the drawing to this? Same conversation as over there. So what I used was something called a bow. A bow has this little piece of string, thin piece of wood. I've seen some people use plastic as well. It's a little bit more forgiving with taking a curve. But I can lay this out onto the curve that I want, and then adjust this little block to whatever position it needs to go in. And then usually the block will hold if it's something that I'm going to need to maintain this curve on for a while. I have a couple of these clamps which are pretty much worthless for anything else except for this. So that holds this into place. So I took that. I don't know if you could see from there, but I drew on a center line of where the center line of my drawing is, front and back. There's also center lines on my bow, and so I was able to transfer this thing over. It's really fussy, you'll find, when you're trying to hold this, and if you're trying to scribe a line, because there's some flexibility in this bow, and you just can't really, you need a third hand basically. So anyway, so I did my best to get this close. Then I aligned this to the drawing until I was happy with it. The thing that I like about something rigid is that I can draw this thing out, get it close, and then I'll be able to flip it, lining up those center lines, and then from there I can see how symmetrical it is from the center or the tangent of that curve, left and right, and if there's one that's dramatically more curved, or I have less material on that side, then I can start to correct it before I transfer that to my brick lay. So that's one way to do this. Once I have this, I can line this thing up here, transfer the line, and then I start cutting. It's a couple of extra steps, and I don't know if it's going to be for everybody. The obvious question is going to be, why couldn't I just use the bow that I used to make my masonite piece? And that's a good question. So let's talk about that. I think that is definitely the easier way to do it, but we should discuss options. Okay, so putting the bow back into place, this is where I want to be. The problem still exists where I'm unable to hold this without this bow flexing as I'm trying to draw the line. So I made these little blocks here, little dovetails here that I just cut off from an extra drawer that I had at some point. So with this, I can use those little worthless clamps that I referred to earlier. Take that there. Something similar here, and now I have a bit more stability onto this curve where I need it. I can also clamp these little blocks into place, and then I'm ready to start transferring those lines. I have to be kind of careful about how much pressure I exert with these clamps, because it's really easy to start throwing this into a position where it starts to introduce new curves. So as much as I can, I want to get this in, make sure that I'm inside of where my curve goes. And that should be rigid enough to start to hold. So what I'm doing here is just loosening up these little blocks to make sure that I'm not imposing new curvature onto this design. So once this bow found its tension once again, then that's where I want everything to kind of naturally fall, and then I'll be able to find a natural spot here. That looks pretty good. I might be a little bit close to the edge. If I am, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to mark on the inside of the curve. Still want to get my hand on the peak of this curve. That way there's less chance or opportunity for this thing to bow or flex. Okay. Once I've got that, get rid of this stuff. Still going to keep this bow into the same position just in case I need to double check something or redraw it, but hopefully you can see that I've got plenty of space here to work with. You'll notice at this point that I probably could have changed the geometry of these blocks to bring this a little bit tighter into my bricklay, but I still have plenty of material here on what will be the inside of this. So whatever I was off for the geometry, I made up for with a little bit of width. And hopefully that helps to visualize the process of developing the bricklay. Okay, so all that's next here is going to be to start cutting the outside of this curve. I'll show you the setup for that in 1 sec.